Hi, I'm Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research, and this is the Wayward Sons Book Group. Tonight, we will be exploring chapters 12 and 13, which will lead us inevitably to considering the influence of the intelligence community on the American UFO community. At further issue is how this affects a society and a culture at large when the media and other tools of intelligence collection become exploited by intelligence agencies. So stick around, it's sure to be an intriguing conversation tonight. Welcome to all of my panel members. I'm glad to have you here. I appreciate your time and attention. And as has become customary, shall we open up the floor for this week's events and topics of interest that some of you might have observed around the social media or news communities?
I just wanted to say that there's a new telepathy tapes live stream by Emily Louise. I haven't watched it yet, but it's sure to be good because I've watched the first two. She also has Heidi Rachel Brown and Jerry Coe, who's a friend of UFOs and a really cool, smart chap. Also, I have AP Strange had me and Steph Quick on his show, which was really fun. We talked about communicating with non-human intelligence.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Emily always does good work. You can count on her videos to be interesting. I'll go ahead and bring up that some of you may know Anomalous Jen on Blue Sky at Anomalous Librarian. She also does a UFO book club and has informed me that my nonfiction book, The Grays Have Been Framed, Exploitation in the UFO Community, will be her book club's next read. So I will include her information in the YouTube video description if anyone would like to be part of that book group or perhaps sit in on any video chats, question and answers types of things that may arise out of it. Really appreciate Anomalous Jen and graciously informing me about the situation. And I look forward to sitting in with them on some of their discussions. And just an FYI for everyone, I have a standing offer that if you would like to read one of my books and now's not a good time to make a purchase, just get a hold of me and I will shoot you over a free searchable PDF of the book. So they were written to be read. So I look forward to this discussion tonight, as well as more with Anomalous Jen as well. So what else is going on, guys?
Just a historical note. Today, July 8th, is the 79th anniversary of when the Roswell story broke in the media. Not when it happened. They actually found the debris in the middle of June. But when the story hit the papers, it hit the AP and the UPA wire on July 8th, 1947. So some people are celebrating that. And of course, they incorrectly celebrate it as the anniversary of the Roswell event, which, you know, if you're going to celebrate, technically it would be sometime in June. But today's when people celebrate, and so that's what a lot of people have also been talking about on social media, is the Roswell anniversary.
Thank you, Jeff. Do you or does anyone know? I guess they have several annual festivals in Roswell now. Was one of them around July 4th?
Yeah, I think they just finished one up. It's usually around July 4th weekend, and I've been a couple of times, but it's been several years since I've been to it.
I was at one year, and I was reading the newspaper at the hotel, and a reporter asked the mayor if he believed that aliens had crashed. And the mayor said, "I believe in the city of Roswell." And I thought that was a really good answer to that question. Yeah.
It's good tourism. And like I bought this shirt, I think at the Walmart in Roswell, because their Walmart has like a whole section of like Roswell alien, like, you know, stuff to buy. And so it's certainly it's been good for the town anyways, whether you believe in it or not.
Right, right. I'll also take the opportunity to direct everyone to the Expanding Frontiers Research Patreon account, where you can sign up for free and get all kinds of resources there. For instance, I post all of these Wayward Sons Book Group videos. I post them on YouTube as well as at the Patreon, but something in addition at the Patreon is that I often put the FOIA request responses we get there before I blog about them in more detail. And some of the recent responses that we've gotten have been on another interim FBI release of records responsive to Senator Harry Reid, who was a bit of a popular yet controversial senator in Nevada with ties to Robert Bigelow and the controversial OSAP program, as well as he was investigated by the FBI pretty much over the course of his career for various circumstances, none of which, it should be noted, resulted in criminal charges being filed. But those records, I alert folks to when there are more releases and point out what I find to be some of the interesting parts of it. Another recent release we got was on a man named Aquino, who was an intelligence asset, a career intelligence officer who founded a satanic church. He founded the Temple of Set after he claimed that he saw Lucifer in the flesh, that Lucifer visited him, kind of Ramtha style type of thing. And so then he founded this temple and eventually had a number of accusations made against him about criminal activity. That didn't come to fruition either, but be advised, there is a lot of adult subject matter in the records. But these are the types of things you can find at the EFR Patreon, and we pursue these types of records and people of interest, intelligence assets, senators, public officials with ties to the fringe community or careers of interest. Any thoughts or comments on any of that?
I just wanted to thank you, Jack, for doing FOIA requests for people and volunteering your time to do that. It's really, really helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a great segue into our Patreon community. Something I do there as well is offer FOIA instruction, help people compose their FOIA requests. In many circumstances, I submit the requests for them and then make them aware of the results as they come in, so that if I'm experienced in the responses, I can kind of guide them through those responses and what happens. And I will walk you through your FOIA requests and help you with the responses if it's in my wheelhouse, or I will find someone that can. So thanks for bringing that up, Rachel. And would anyone like to volunteer to begin reading for us this evening? We are on page 282 of the PDF.
A substantial amount of material was made available to us about Joseph Bryan and the surrounding characters via the Freedom of Information Act and related methods. There is clearly, however, more to learn. Whether further answers to key questions can be obtained at this distant point in time is yet to be seen. I have a number of FOIA requests still pending as of this writing. Perhaps some will bear significant fruit. In yet other instances, FOIA officers replied that requested files were identified, yet after multiple searches could not be located. All things considered, I do not find that particularly unreasonable. Disappointing, yes, but not necessarily unreasonable. It's been a while since Townsend Brown met Nicholas de Roquefort. A question we're going to keep coming back to, the more we learn about the intelligence officers involved with NICAP and the circles they kept, is if it seems feasible they would have been interested in the organization in an unofficial capacity. Are we to believe these men in the business of the State Department professional spy trade, employed as Central Intelligence officers and experts in psychological warfare, all just decided over the course of NICAP's 20-plus years of operating it would be fun or rewarding to be in a UFO group? Are we to believe all of their employers, former or current, found no conflicts of interest, potential security issues, or similar problematic aspects of their involvement with NICAP? I do not find such scenarios likely. Sure, maybe a CIA propaganda specialist decided to help with UFO disclosure. It's possible, and the irony would be fascinating, but no, I do not find it probable. Statements attributed to Joseph Bryan's son indicated he did not suspect his father had an agenda to undermine NICAP. Moreover, CDB Bryan apparently described his father's outspoken stance on UFOs as an embarrassment. Anyone who knows anything about the history of NICAP knows that the group didn't need anybody's help in its disintegration. It simply self-destructed, CDB Bryan was quoted. He apparently went on to write, "My father's unswerving, outspoken faith in UFOs was, I felt, something of an embarrassment. I do not believe it was the sort of public position an agent would take whose covert goal was to smother interest in UFOs." I tend to I tend to agree, yet it still does not absolve intelligence agencies or some of their personnel from covert interest or discrete agendas pertaining to NICAP. Whether the agency intended to destroy NICAP is but one potential scenario. There are many more possibilities. In his previously referenced book, Howard Hunt wrote that Joe Bryan eventually resigned in disgust from the OPC. Non-operational OPC bean counters and administrators made work increasingly harder, Hunt asserted. This allegedly resulted in the departure of Bryan, who Hunt described as our creative thinker. Bryan's apparent departure from OPC would probably have been in 1953 or so after the office merged with the Office of Special Operations, forming the Directorate of Plans. Perhaps Bryan stayed on with the agency in some capacity after his reported split from OPC, or perhaps not. Either way, we can easily surmise an environment of turmoil and distrust in the intelligence community. This is evident in the previously reviewed FBI investigations and particularly the letters provided to the Bureau that were exchanged between Captain Winston and Colonel Bryan. Combined with Winston's published writing, which included a novel about a heroic conservative Pentagon official fighting the good fight against communism in spite of attempts to undermine him, a theme is clear. The theme was not even overtly expressed and explicitly played upon in the work we explored of Colonel Amos. The theme was even overtly expressed. It's also as old as politics itself. People, in this case CIA officers, feeling persecuted and hampered by bureaucratic red tape. That might be considered particularly ironic, given the things we now know about the lack of effective CIA oversight and the extremes the agency employed to further its priorities. It is indeed no less ironic those charged with oversight felt stifled as well, as suggested by events surrounding Nelson Rockefeller, the planning coordination group he chaired, and of course, eventual hearings on MKUltra and unwitting human experimentation. A feasible argument could still be made that perhaps Bryan, disgusted with an intelligence community which he had served that nonetheless apparently came looking to tarnish his reputation at one point, became resentful and distrusting of Uncle Sam's minions. This might be suggested, for instance, in the discrepancies concerning statements made by Edgar Hoover and circumstances surrounding Winston's testimony to a Senate committee. The Soviet Union was no doubt pleased with America's obsession with loyalty as prioritized and fueled by the FBI and select politicians, and the resulting accusations and decreased productivity it manifested. It is possible Bryan subsequently numbered among a percentage of intelligence officers who got caught up in the UFO steeplechase when they saw their colleagues getting involved with NICAP and got on board for various personal reasons. Perhaps his disgust with a turning tide of CIA directors, merging offices, and untrustworthy bureaucrats contributed to suspicions he may have harbored that there actually was a significant UFO cover-up. Or maybe the subject provided an attractive forum for criticizing his former employers. He would have been neither the first nor the last to argue any given stance on a UFO topic based more on the dislike of the opposition than concern about the issue at stake. Perhaps arguably most likely, however, is that Colonel Bryan was doing his job, whatever the objectives may have been, a job he may have taken pride in for personal reasons as compared to financial compensation. It seems noteworthy Bryan took on the ghostwriting project for Aga Khan in 1953, presumably after his purported CIA departure and as the incorporation of NICAP grew closer. Bryan's experience with the FBI obscenity room and the tell-all nature of the book project seem relevant, as does Bryan's expertise in propaganda. It is difficult to dismiss potential implications of his continuing official relationship with the agency and/or U.S. intelligence community in the Aga Khan project. It is for such reason it is for such reasons I find Bryan's experience in the OPC potentially relevant. The talents and activities of his crew hold implications to the 1950s UFO genre as a whole, but each of their continuing service to the CIA arguably carries significance to the NICAP story. The career paths taken by members of Bryan's crew over the course of the 1950s and 1960s offers us a profile of his OPC outfit and intriguing implications. If Joe Bryan was not, at the least, called upon by the company for the occasional favor or task, he would be the only one among them who was not. Howard Hunt continued as a significant CIA officer, given particular credit for his work in Operation PB Success, among other notable events. Pinky Thompson became a special assistant and an asset in the funneling of funds, as apparently did his son. Gates Lloyd became a deputy director of support and worked with funding and budgets, and his son apparently assisted as well. Finis Farr was a high-profile writer with Hollywood connections. Carlton Alsop was recognized as the agency's most valuable Hollywood asset. And Hugh Troy was a talented artist and perception manager who oversaw the distribution of CIA propaganda into publications throughout the world. With all of that being the case, we are left to consider their boss, Joseph Bryan, joined NICAP. It seems likely that intelligence agencies indeed had concerns about Kehoe's sources of classified information and reports perceived to relate to UFOs. It only seems reasonable the CIA, FBI, Air Force, and other agencies would be concerned about identifying those sources and any individuals overly interested in them. It might even be considered somewhat surprising if there were not some lower profile assets that Brian involved in NICAP and infiltrating the lines of communication. There is even the possibility the entire operation was a counterintelligence effort designed to roll up spies, aka people inordinately interested in gaining the trust of personnel with situational ethics when it came to leaking classified information. Kehoe and his closest supporters, those genuinely interested in the UFO mystery, would not necessarily have been aware of such an operation. As has been aptly pointed out by others, the best front organization is one that doesn't know it's a front. Therein might lie some of the reasons for the NICAP resignations of esteemed officers, as compared to the rumors they were pressured to leave the organization. It seems about as likely some of them preferred to avoid getting caught up in security issues and potential spy games, as opposed to the idea they were urged to resign from NICAP by former employers for other reasons. Perhaps further research will provide deeper understandings yet to be found, but my general thesis is the intelligence community played a significant role in the incorporation of NICAP. I suspect the interest rose and fell over time, with assets serving various purposes to one extent or other as deemed advantageous. In the end, the CIA seems to have used it. In the end, the CIA seems to have used its associates to oversee managing and eventually dissolving the organization. That was done for what could have been a number of reasons, none of which I suspect had much to do with UFOs.
Thank you, Rachel. Comments, opposition, thoughts, questions?
I had wondered if Carlton Alsop was related to Joseph and Stuart Alsop, because it's not a very common name. And Joseph Alsop was a journalist who was also a covert CIA asset. But apparently no relation, just share the similar last name.
Yeah, I was fascinated by that at one point too, as apparently was Edgar Hoover, that he made a note in the Allsop FBI records. There's, how he'll make annotations, and one of them is no relation to the Allsop brothers that were journalists. As yeah, that would be intriguing indeed.
Why was Bryant ghost writing for Aga Khan?
He was a writer, so it wasn't as odd that he was ghostwriting for celebrities, perhaps, as that he's like, it's really not odd. Like, of course, he was wanted by the CIA because he was a talented writer. He was widely read. His
Okay.
his family was in the newspaper industry that he then inherited. So that would be, yeah, um it just kind of seems like the job description, to a certain extent.
It's amazing to me how these guys, apparently back in the day, you could work at the CIA and also pretty much work full time doing whatever else you were doing at the same time period. And so like these guys, the whole time they were working at the CIA, were putting out books, writing articles for magazines, and they had this whole other life while they were also employed in the CIA. So I guess maybe that probably happens today as well. But we just people aren't as public about being in the CIA as they used to, unless they quit. Then they go on the podcast circuit as a former CIA officer. and get a lot of play out of that.
I
Yeah.
think.
I'd
Go
wondered
ahead.
before. I'd wondered before as well. Like, how do these people have so many hours in the day to do this? But
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I feel like for someone in the 1950s, the term CIA would have a very different ring to it from someone, living in the 1980s.
That
Like,
it would. That
like
it would.
some of these names that they use for organizations like the OPC or like Council Services, etc. Like they have these this kind of hollow sort of sound to them, like it doesn't mean anything or it's like innocuous. And I'm wondering if the CIA might have used to have more of that kind of sound to it for your average American citizen.
Absolutely. Like if you were a civil servant, that in itself is honorable. Like whatever the agency you're with, OPC, right, Department of this, Office of that, would have been considered honorable. Yes. And I think too, Jeff, like what you're getting at, there's definitely a different type of CIA service that like Gates Lloyd undertook as an accountant and deputy director in the Department of Plans as compared to Howard Hunt, who was involved in a Guatemala coup and the Watergate plumber and God himself only knows what all else. And I think then we're going to get into are we talking about guys that live in DC and they put on a coat and tie and they drive over to the headquarters and clock in at 8 in the morning and draw Social Security and like take out home loans and list CIA as their employer? Or are we talking about people that, like, on paper, there would never even be a tie to the agency because they're paid through a university that got money from the Geschichter Fund that they report their employer is Georgetown University? Yeah, there's, or a freelance writer that somehow makes more than he sold in books or something. Yeah, yeah. But I get your point there, Jeff, that like, yeah, like Gates Lloyd obviously had a different career path than Joseph Bryant, you know.
And as we've seen, a lot of these people obviously didn't even need the money. It's not like they needed to go work for the CIA. They were independently wealthy. And in some cases, probably even putting up some of their own money for some of the stuff they were doing. So I guess they joined up out of patriotism, and it's the right thing to do. I don't think many of these people doing it because they needed the career. They needed the paycheck because like say, Brian inherited wealth from his family. A lot of these other guys inherited great deals of wealth from their family. I don't think they were doing it for the money anyways, but you never know.
my assumption has been that this is just mine or my theory I have, that with great sums of wealth, that great sums of wealth brings power, and that wanting to use that power to shape the world in a way that continues to allow that power and wealth to exist. And if you're wealthy enough, I mean, you can only buy so many yachts and whatnot. And so it becomes an exercise, like I said, in the power to shape the world. That's just my theory.
Related to that, Sharon, is if you notice the CIA people who were like involved very early on they were kind of like close to captains of industry. And I think they had an ideological commitment to defending free market capitalism. But interestingly, this was during the New Deal era. So, you know, it was more like protecting US interests overseas. So like the Guatemala coup wasn't, you know, mixed with that, because they were overthrowing a government that they saw as hostile to American business interests. And stuff like that. A lot of covert operations were, you know, nominally about anti-communism, but they basically regarded any threat to U.S. business interests as, you know, stemming from Moscow. So I'm also wondering, like, to what extent did the UFO interest correlate with like a commitment to the, you know, defending the U.S. free market system?
That's a really good line of thought and a rabbit hole I went about halfway down after this book was written. And you can find some blog posts at the UFO Trail blog that resulted from FOIA requests that got material on Leo McCormick, who was a co-founder of Counsel Services with Mary Von King. And he left Counsel Services to be a case manager in the Economic Cooperation Administration, which I had already learned by that point was a CIA asset that subcontracted Counsel Services. So he left Counsel Services to work for the ECA, and he became very much involved in the political machinations taking place in Europe. And as post-World War II coalitions were being formed, I don't have an end thesis or an idea of what that all amounts to, but you're right on target there, Luis, that it's all around that like these guys like Louis Amos and the other people that Counsel Services represented, Townsend Brown, and whatever their deal was, it was not limited to just propaganda and sideline influencing. Their value, Counsel Services' value to the CIA and to the Economic Cooperation Administration, I think, was to collect intelligence that the ECA then gave to the CIA. And we have the letter from Roscoe Hillenkoetter at the CIA with the ECA, where it's established that the ECA was collecting financial intelligence for the CIA, economic intelligence for the CIA. And then they contracted Counsel Services. Then Leo McCormick left to work for the ECA. And yeah, he became very involved in directing politics, rallying for political platforms and things like that about the New Deal and different trade policies and things like that. So it can become head spinning, as it's meant to do, I would suspect, for people that aren't really plugged into that lifestyle and know what they're looking at, which I did not and still do not fully when I, as I say, went about halfway down that rabbit hole.
And by the way, the CIA is often nicknamed the company, and they use the word assets as well. So there's already like a business kind of orientation in how they approach everything. It's already kind of implicit in, you know, how they view the world and how they approach like covert operations and their organization.
And in fact, a point that I think, there's a couple of points that I think make it really difficult to dismiss the NICAP saga as coincidences or CIA assets and officers that just were interested in UFOs. And one of those is council services and involvement. Another is that if it were just a matter of council services represented Townsend Brown, somehow they knew each other. He was hoping they could get him grant funding. And they ended up, because they knew Townsend Brown, having NICAP as a client as well. That would make sense up to the point that council services inserted itself in running NICAP. Like they wanted authority and positioned a State Department asset in Thomas O'Keefe as being responsible for appointing what were termed regional managers to handle other aspects of it. This seems to have not come to fruition, but I think that's an important part of the story, that it would be easy to say, council services, well, they represented Amos, they represented NICAP. I mean, everybody in DC was tied to the intelligence community somehow. What's the big deal? That makes sense to me up to the point that council services wanted to run NICAP with a State Department man, no less.
I had a question on Brian's contribution. So we have a lot of his associations, and he's on the board. And this might just be a comprehension issue I have. I must have missed this, but what was his contribution in NICAP other than the advocacy part of it? Did he play a part in, I know there's an education aspect to it where NICAP would go and educate lawmakers about this topic and control. What was his major output, I guess, while on the board? Or was he just nice to have because of his background?
Others might can add to it, but to the best of my knowledge, the board didn't do a lot. Probably had annual or periodic meetings, and I think you're right, were primarily in place as figureheads and to disseminate their statements to media outlets.
Yeah. And so the also assumed position too was looking for leaks, let's say, coming in from intelligence and whatnot. Is that something you would find in FOIA, like letters to Hoover or something like that? Or what element of the covert aspect would you or wish you could uncover from Brian that would show his other usefulness on the board, which it was the covert side?
That's a good question, and the CIA is not going to acknowledge a relationship with him.
Yeah,
and thus aren't releasing his files. I'm pretty sure is their stance on Brian. See, there's another school of thought with the Kehoe is soliciting intelligence officers for classified information. Another school of thought on it, and it's not new, was that he was being fed disinformation to disseminate. And that I think we see a lot of this today, that while the information may not come directly back to the DOD, they're certainly not doing anything to stop so-called whistleblowers from going up on Capitol Hill and making outrageous statements. So one can interpret they find it somewhat advantageous. And so there's that school of thought that Kehoe was also being fed stories. And so in that way, Brian and others that were lending credibility to this and these stories may have had some purpose in that way. I think it's a good question, like, what would we be looking for?
Right.
I tried to help James Carrion with some FOIA requests at one point, just because I was interested in it. And we tried to get some records from units that were identified as conducting deception operations during World War II and during the 1946-47 era that he focuses on. And we were not successful. We could like get their charter and that things explaining they were set up to disseminate misinformation and disinformation and to serve the national security apparatus and things like that. But we could even get the names of a couple of people that were involved in it that were relevant to the research he's produced in the Roswell deception, his book. But we were not able to obtain like a piece of paper that says, here's an operation we did on this date with this agency at this location, are more difficult to come by. Like an Operation Mincemeat type of thing where they, put bogus documents in a briefcase and attached it to a dead body and intended it to be found. It's rare that we get some kind of document confirmation of things like that, but we keep looking. That's all I can tell you is we keep filing and looking.
Well, this last section answered one question that was kind of been in the back of my mind for a while, which was, if council services, if, ECA was basically a front organization, front for the CIA, was council services also a front? And then if you were working for an organization, would you know if it was a front for the CIA? And I guess the answer is if the CIA is doing their job, then you probably wouldn't know.
Not if you're not like read in, no. Like no, not if you're like the media specialist that council services hired to go with them to China to teach the Chinese people how to make films. No, you wouldn't. I think that's a very interesting aspect of it. My personal opinion is that had a lot to do with NICAP having 3 treasurers in 3 months. Is getting told I'm gonna pull a line from another book some of us are reading where a woman told a reporter, believe what your president tells you to believe.
I found it really interesting that CDB Brian, you quoted him saying that like he didn't really understand his father's position on UFOs, and it seemed really striking to me. We were talking about this before the show, that like he wouldn't be aware you know, that his father's like involvement of this in this had nothing to do with UFOs, which I mean, it seems apparent to me at least. So, and that's quoted from his book. C.D.B. Bryan was a writer, and he wrote a book about this big abduction conference at MIT, and that's where Jack is quoting that from, which in itself is very interesting as well. So, you know, is C.D.B. Bryan one of those people who is looking behind the curtain? Your comments suggested to like I think if I'm understanding you correctly that he probably had some awareness, you know, that he's kind of being a little bit deceptive.
We can never know what someone is thinking, but when people either intentionally don't cover all the bases or they honestly haven't figured it out and don't cover all the bases, neither one shows them to be a good source for information. And by covering all the bases, I mean to imply that the issue here is either Joseph Bryan sabotaged NICAP or he didn't, I find bordering on intellectual dishonesty. And that's pretty much NICAP's position on it too, is either the CIA guys sabotaged us or they didn't. So if they didn't, they were good guys. Is either naive or obtuse, and neither one bodes well, in my opinion. Others, of course, have much different takes on that. But as I say, I just think there are a couple of circumstances here that it's really difficult to overlook as coincidental or insignificant. One that we're about to read about, the way Colonel Amos inserted himself in that UFO hoax is fascinating in itself. Like if that's all we had, that Colonel Amos, a longtime CIA career intelligence officer with a big, widely read newsletter, married a intelligence officer, contacted the Air Force about what was a UFO hoax, inserted himself in it, and the investigating officer, due to his diligence and attention to detail, tracked down that names were inserted into that story at Colonel Amos. And Colonel Amos claimed to get those names from a guy that claimed he didn't recognize the name. So he tracked it down to Colonel Amos. And that happened a few weeks before the big flap, the big DC flap in 1952. That would be fascinating in and of itself. And then he was a client of counsel services. Just adds a whole nother dimension to it for me. I mean, maybe others would not see it that way. So shall we read it?
Chapter 13 in the news. Although DCI Alan Dulles authorized MKUltra on April 13, 1953, the project roots can be traced back much earlier, as is typically the case with any given program. CIA directors Roscoe Hillenkoetter and Walter Bedell Smith have their rightful spots as well in overseeing the progression of unconventional warfare and mind control research. It was Hillenkoetter who was at the helm in 1949 when the Advisory Committee to the Secretary of Defense was meeting, as documented in the previously explored FBI memo on biological warfare. Readers will recall CIA representatives sought support from the Advisory Committee for what was described as vigorous exploration techniques to achieve positive control of experimental human subjects. A CIA memo titled Subject Project Bluebird indicates Hillenkoetter's authorization of activities and funding for the MKUltra Forerunner in 1950. Knowledge of Bluebird was specified to be limited to an absolute minimum number of people. That need to know basis was designated to include representatives of the Office of Policy Coordination. The memo continued. The purpose of this project is to provide for the immediate establishment of interrogation teams for the operational support of OSO, Office of Special Operations, and OPC, Office of Policy Coordination, activities. Please allow me to briefly direct our attention back to the FBI memo. Subject, Lewis Stenrod Thompson, also known as Pinky Thompson. The memo documented Thompson executed an employment application for the CIA in June 1950, coincidentally or otherwise 2 months after Hillenkoetter authorized Bluebird. The memo was also placed in the file of Joseph Bryan III for whatever specific reasons. Back to the 1950 CIA Bluebird memo, it stipulated for a doctor's office to be set up in Washington, staffed with psychiatrists and personnel to serve as cover for training, experimentation, and indoctrination purposes in the use of drugs and hypnosis. Field support for interrogation teams was designed to be provided by either OSO or OPC. A total annual budget of $65,515 was allocated for Bluebird, with $18,000 of it earmarked for transportation, second only to payroll. That was an estimated $1,500 per person for each trip, projecting 3 people making an average of 4 trips per year. Factoring inflation, that would be almost $17,000 per trip for each person, not counting salary. They got around. In August 1951, the name of Bluebird was changed to Artichoke. The launching of Artichoke took place during the tenure of DCI Smith, the man responsible for initially pulling the OPC under his and CIA control before merging it with OSO in the Directorate of Plans in 1952. Artichoke received guidance from at least mid-1951 through 1953 from the Bluebird Artichoke Committee, which consisted of representation from various divisions, including the Office of Policy Coordination. Frank Wisner, who directed the OPC and was credited with its expansion and subsequent reach, led the above-referenced Directorate of Plans from 1952 to 1958, with future DCI Richard Helms as his Chief of Operations. Alan Dulles took the Central Intelligence reins and authorized MKUltra in 1953, and it was Helms who would eventually give the now infamous orders to destroy all related documents. It was apparently only due to some boxes of overlooked files, later obtained by John Marks through a FOIA lawsuit, that the public ever began to learn anything at all about the grossly unethical research projects. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sharon. Any comment? I mean, like, you know, where do you start with the behavior modification topic? But does anyone have anything that came to mind with any of that?
I always think about its application today and the things that the CIA does today, not based on like the morality of what they're doing, because obviously MKUltra is gross, despicable, but also just in terms of, you know, thinking about, we've talked about like In-Q-Tel in the past and how funding happens there, creating fronts, creating shops to move something forward. I think about the modern disclosure movement, which to me just seems like lobbying effort for tech transfer, right? I'm being a little brash in my assumption on this, right? And it requires a Jack Brewer like deep dive to uncover these things. But I just wonder what other applications. The playbook always seems to be the same, and what are the applications today? And that's, I think, what's most relevant when we have discussion here is I'm trying to learn from what happened in the past and solve the mysteries that are of today and why people are doing what they do. So that thought, I guess, is what are those mechanisms that we see today? And I think I named some, but I don't know if there are more or if I'm missing something. But it appears to me that if you can't legally do something, the CIA is going to find a way to find maybe legal loopholes. Maybe it's not illegal, I don't know. But they're going to find ways to be more nimble, I guess, when it comes to In-Q-Tel, right? They're basically the startups as nimble as you can be, being a state-sponsored venture capital firm. I mean, it just speaks for itself. But then the lobbying aspect of it too. So like, where does that also pop up into like current day? That's what I think of when I read this. And I just wonder what other applications or what playbooks go on that aren't being discussed, that aren't in the news or in this topic, I guess.
In the book group, another book group that I have, the book that we're currently covering, I've learned that operations, they continue, you know, like you're saying, things today are a continuation of something, of an operation that happened X number of years ago, which were a continuation of operations that, you know, the public might look at and think, oh, these are individual events that are happening, but that thing started in the 50s, drove the course of history in the direction that we find now. And that what incentive would the CIA have to stop the possibilities of things they could accomplish if they already had mechanisms in place to continue on? So I don't know the connection of things now. I just know that historically operations have just continued in different forms.
I'll add too, so I'm not like guiding people's thinking, because it doesn't necessarily have to be the CIA or the government that's doing this. It could be private contractors, it could be aerospace defense that are leveraging people's power from government to be a lobbying arm and not having to register or go through legal processes to do so. So in this case, it might actually be the reverse, where we're having private contractors developing these the same strategy, but the tables turned, like, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the case of Boyd Bushman that we considered, where he seems to have possibly been approached by people under the guise of their interest in UFOs and spacemen and whatnot. And he had security clearance at, I think it was Lockheed Martin. And the reason we know that is because they contacted the FBI. If the FBI had not released it through the Freedom of Information Act, there's no way to ask Lockheed Martin what's going on at their water cooler, you know. So that's a very valid point about contracting. And I think we did see it beginning with, so CIA sets up the Office of Policy Coordination and the Economic Cooperation Administration. I mean, who's not for an economic cooperation with Germany and South America and Central America? You got to be on board with that. And then they started contracting to council services and other private agencies and firms that we're just lucky to find the occasional letter in an archive somewhere, you know, that council services had no responsibility to save letters and diaries and calendars for the Freedom of Information Act. But I'd feel remiss if I didn't say a direct line from Roscoe Hillenkoetter and Walter Smith and Alan Dulles' CIA administrations to today is CIA black sites and torture techniques. And I would say Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, because I think that's correct, but I also think it minimizes it, believe it or not, because there's a whole lot more sites and what were called extraordinary renditions, which was kidnapping citizens, than just at Guantanamo Bay. But that, I think, is a direct line to, yeah, let's rent an office at the strip mall and, you know, call it a dentist's office or whatever we want to, and we'll stick some psychologists in there and give them a budget to travel to if they're needed in Eastern Europe and figure out how these shots and hypnosis and LSD work. I think that's direct correlation to Guantanamo Bay.
There's also a kind of disturbing tie-in here with Michael Flynn of QAnon fame. He was a general who served, I think, in Afghanistan, and he used some psychological warfare psyop stuff in that theater, and then he applied it in the US to kind of gaslight and traumatize the American population to go along with the Trump agenda. And, you know, QAnon has got some kind of esoteric and paranormal overlaps as well. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so, you know, Flynn, a lot of work on him has been done by Jim Stewartson, who kind of tracks the QAnon space.
I was getting ready to, Allison and I are very good acquaintances with Jim.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I just thought I'd mention that.
Who Flynn, who so, do you know about the lawsuit Flynn filed against Jim?
Yeah.
So that meant Jim's work was so close that it was enough to want to silence him.
Sharon, just in like one sentence, what was the lawsuit, just so I know the context?
Jim had, you know, accused him in his writing of a number of things, and so Flynn sued him over that.
For libel.
Was it for libel?
One of the things was for saying he was QAnon.
Yes, yes. And
so that was defamatory, even though he was riding that wave like the UFO topic and all the popular
Correct.
to get
And
a populist mandate, basically.
correct. And, you know, Jim would have proof of things that Flynn had put out himself or his speeches or on and on and on. And a judge went through and was like, this is true, this is true, this is true. The last bit, they were going to go to trial, and the very last minute, Flynn dismissed it.
I think most people file these lawsuits kind of as a nuisance thing, like, and they know it's never going to go anywhere. And so when it actually comes down to it, they've got to like cancel them. But they just hope the threat is enough to.
Right.
They're called SLAP lawsuits. They're a strategic lawsuit. I forget what the acronym stands for, but they're strategic. That's the exact reason. There's no other reason than to just bury you in legal fees and slow everything down and try to shut you up.
This is not related to the CIA at all, but Brian's comments a few minutes ago, just I couldn't help but think of today with what's going on with the algorithms that can psychologically manipulate people today, and the scale with which they can be deployed are staggering. And this kind of just on the topic of behavior modification.
And all right, a kind of warfare on the American people.
Yeah.
You don't need drugs and psychedelics injected in people
No.
anymore.
Not when you can get their amygdalas.
Yeah. And social media is basically like a drug. It hits the same reward receptors as, drugs do. So
I always say that the For You page on Twitter is not for you. Okay, that is not for you.
Yeah. Before there was social media, someone once said that the most effective mind control device ever invented was the television set. And so I think, yeah, you could take that same idea and apply it to that low jack that we carry around with us everywhere we go, and social media and cell phones.
And by the way, Russia should never be forgotten as a player in this whole thing, because they've got a long history of psychological operations, what they call active measures,
Yep.
And gaslighting. They've refined that really to a fine art over the decades. Yep. And there's through line all the way from the KGB to the current FSB, and they use it as a sort of integral part of their warfare doctrine, or what they call a hybrid warfare.
Yes.
Right. So they kind of amplify divisions within U.S. and Western societies to try to, destabilize our societies. But really, those divisions are homegrown. So we shouldn't exaggerate the Russian role either, but we should also acknowledge it so we can actually deal with it.
That's a fair point, Luis. And betraying human rights in order to conduct torture and experimentation on people that are being held indefinitely without charges. In my opinion, then your enemy won. Like if you'll scrap your value system, then it's showing that the agencies doing that either don't share those values or was not very committed to them in the first place, in my opinion.
This is a question I've asked you, Jack, before, but everyone else can offer their opinion as well. I'm just curious, if I may. But what is kind of the ethical line that you would not cross in terms of like these covert operations? When is it justified to do them, and when is it not? So you could argue that, you know, the Western democracies have to play dirty sometimes to counter, you know, the autocratic regimes and their, because they don't have any really limits on this. So why should we always play by the rules, basically? So what is like the limit on what you would accept as okay?
Go ahead, guys.
Well, I think that I don't know. I think it's really messy. I think that our system itself is fundamentally flawed. You know, I think that I believe in some form of democracy, but when you have a democracy with hundreds of millions of people, you know, like, and you can't just like be like Aristotle and just be like, oh, we don't need media at all. Like, let's just ban all media or something like that, you know, that I don't think there's a fine line that exists, but like, I think that like you could come up with rules and laws and stuff like that to deal with specific situations. But I I think that the society we have right now is too complex. Sorry, that's just my not it's just a kind of a general broad response.
I would be so, I don't know if wimpy is the right word, but it would be, I would be out so fast if because I'm so sensitive to people hurting other people, you know, that I can't do this, I'm out. So I don't even think
I
I could
think
do,
that's a characteristic to be proud of.
you know,
Yeah,
ugh.
me too.
I think part of the problem, I don't know where the fine line would be. If it was personally up to me, I'm more like Sharon. I think it's hard for us to tell as citizens because so much is hidden from us, and the excuse is in the interest of national security. And these covert operations happen in the interest of national security. And how many coups have we done on other countries? Like, to me, that's a line. Like, why are we doing something like that to promote democracy? I mean, that's what we're told. And for a while, I guess you just, okay, what can you do about it? But I just think there's a huge problem. And I get it. Like, you can't make everything public because there are legitimate national security concerns. But I think everything gets covered up under that umbrella, and we don't really know what's going on. And let's face it, then we don't really have much of a say in the decisions that are made. We don't even have a choice.
Rachel, one thing that Allison, Jack and I discussed in our book group is that you can't vote your way out of the things that the CIA does.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, that's the thing is like you're saying, Allison, you can't, if you're going to have a country like the US, you can't have everything be public for security reasons, but that creates a paradox, like an ethical paradox, basically. And I think, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, when the guy behind the curtain, you know, to use the Oz analogy, loses his mind, there's a problem. Yeah.
Well, and I feel like going back to what Sharon was saying a lot earlier is that a lot of these guys, it seems like they are more motivated about preserving their way of life. And I think there's a really strong and going way back culture around that, like I was talking about the liars clubs and in the 1800s and stuff like that, or like the Pinkertons who predated the FBI, who were basically defending corporate interests and, worked in a very um, imperialist and racist way as essentially a security force. And like so, I think of these guys, doing pranks and stuff like that, and then turning around and using those same skills to like supposedly defend democracy when they're actually, you know, they're preventing democracy from being able to happen by deceiving people and manipulating them.
Fair point. I think
Louise, oh, want to go ahead? Louise, one thing that Allison and Jim and our group would get so maddeningly frustrated with the previous administration was not simply naming what was happening in terms of psychological warfare on the American people. Just simply naming it.
Speaking, not just on that note, speaking of Russia, that's part of their education is psyops.
Yes.
So they're at least can identify that they exist. There's a huge population of people in the United States that don't even know they exist. So how can you even
protect yourself if you've not named the disease, basically?
In a best case scenario, I would say the lines for covert activity have been pre-drawn in the Constitution. Realistically, there are situational ethics, and then it goes case to case. I'm reminded I was in a large sales organization once, and the CEO used to say something to the effect of, if my lawyer says it's ethical, it's ethical. And if he says it's not, then we're not doing it. So if you got any doubts about it, you probably shouldn't do it. And at least if you're not like proud to tell the news that comes to your desk what you did, then go ask the lawyer before you do it. Yeah.
And what if your lawyer is, Better Call Saul?
Yeah, what if your lawyer is the kind that W had, that's gonna figure out how anything he wants to do is legal? Yeah.
Yeah, this makes me think of like The Wire. There's this one episode where there's like this gangster character in court, and like the lawyer's questioning him or something, and he's just like, I do the same thing you do, because he's a lawyer who just protects criminals.
Yeah, yeah. Any other comments on where the lines should be for covert operations?
I'll just say if you're a parent, I think that from time to time you will pause your ethics for the good of the outcome. A very extreme, stupid example, if you want to read your kid's diary to make sure they're not doing something bad or whatever, like you would bend your ethics for, and so you would not do it to a point where you're breaking trust, but you know what I'm saying? I think we're with politics and even economics, we're not these pure robots, which makes us human, where it's going to make a perfect economic decision. We're imperfect, and then we make those adjustments based on doing the right thing and then correcting the wrong thing. So as long as there's like that yin and yang balance of something, I think we're just talking about the human condition and understanding that there is measure in it that a little bit is okay and a little bit is okay here and there. And then the extremes are the bad thing. So I'm not like a philosophy person. I think Louise, like, I was thinking about that for a long time, but I just try to bring it back to something like parenting. It's just like, yes, I'm going to cheat and cut a corner here and there for the good of my family when I have to. And I feel like I have a good sense of when that is, but I would call myself a good parent. So.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a complicated world, and sometimes making the best decision is not necessarily like making the 100% ethically correct decision, but just the most pragmatic one given the situation. But kind of dovetailing with what you're talking about too, I think like if, intelligence organizations worked more closely with the public, to cultivate trust, like with, for example, what Allison was pointing out about Russia actually educating people about psyops, or to give another example with the Fugo balloon attacks, you know, people were working, according to Ross Cohen's book, there were a lot of community, representatives and people like that who were aware of the Fugo attacks, as well as people working in media, but the media didn't publish the Fugo attacks and was able to cooperate with the military. Um, so, and like, my sister was telling me about like psyops because she worked in the military, and she was saying that, yeah, we have psyops that we do. I don't know what those entail because she didn't tell me, but like, it seems like you can coordinate psyops with people who are not in intelligence, and be transparent with them, and that would cultivate trust. And also you would be working with democracy as opposed to against it.
Fair points. Thank you, everybody.
Comment on the Fugo balloon things. My grandma lived here in Oregon during the Fugo balloon stuff, and she pointed out that yeah, they didn't want to put it in the media because they didn't want to scare or panic, like a widespread kind of panic thing. But she said that people would come to church or like Lions Club meetings or things like that, and warn them about the balloons and tell them what to do if they encounter one and whatnot. And so like they were informing people, they just weren't using the media. They were like going like through local communities and churches and things like that to notify people about the balloons.
Yeah, they
That's what my
did.
grandma said anyways.
Yeah, no, Ross Cohen also says that they were using like word of mouth and stuff like
Yeah.
that, which I think is really cool. Oregon, by the way, that's where the infamous Fugo explosion happened that like killed 5 people. So
Yep.
it'd be interesting to hear your grandma's thoughts on that, or her perspective.
She's passed, but yeah. It's that was back, I think May 5th or something, May 5th, when that explosion happened. Yeah.
Sorry.
What was that? The explosion? I'm not familiar with that.
It was a Fugo balloon bomb that landed in, I can never remember the details of things. I'm really bad, but it was an incident that happened where like I think it was a family and they found one of these balloons that had landed in Oregon, and then one of the kids was like messing with it or like touched it or something like that, and then it exploded. So the Fugo balloons, they had bombs attached to them.
Ooh.
And the idea was basically to, cause things like wildfires, and also, to spread illnesses and stuff like that, as according to Jeff K, which, I think his evidence is pretty convincing that
And who was behind these balloons?
Japan during the war. So this was,
Oh.
yeah.
It's a very, very underreported story still. Yeah. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Rachel.
Yeah, Kay kind of documents how there's just like a lot of information missing from the public about the Fugo balloons, both because Japan destroyed a lot of it in relation to other war crimes and in relation to probably germ warfare. And but what's really interesting is that he also argues that the US also concealed a lot of information about the Fugo attacks. But I mean, it wasn't entirely like Americans didn't understand anything at all of what was going on until this incident in Oregon. It was more like, a lot of people didn't know what was going on. Because like we were saying before, people would spread it, the military would spread information word of mouth, but they made sure that the newspapers weren't publishing any information about it. But the germ warfare thing wasn't made public at that time and is basically just like we don't really know exactly what the full extent of that is.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pregnant woman, actually, a pregnant woman, Elsie Mitchell, and her 5 children that found it in a forest. And I believe it's the only American citizens that died on U.S. soil during World War II, is this family that died from a Fugo bomb in May 5th, 19. Yeah.
Yeah, like for a long time, historians kind of like portrayed this as sort of like a footnote, but it's really fascinating. There were thousands of balloons that made it to North America, and these were the first intercontinental like weapons. I'm not sure if they qualify as like ballistic missiles, but I mean, I think Kay makes a good argument that Japan had a certain level of, if they sent enough balloons, they could essentially sort of vaguely target a particular region.
And it somewhat worked, at least to a limited extent. 2 months before this bomb killed this family, a Fugo balloon hit a tension power line at Bonneville and knocked out our power to the Hanford nuclear plant for like
That's,
2 weeks.
yeah,
So
that's true. Yeah.
so they caused some other damage besides for that family, but I think by and large, they mostly didn't do a whole lot. They would find debris sometimes, like some of these balloons that would land and whatnot, but I think the damage was mostly limited. But they did reach here far enough to cause damage.
I wonder if somebody involved in Unit 731, the Japanese bio warfare unit, notorious for like atrocities against civilians and POWs, because after the war, the US government actually gave some of them effectively immunity from prosecution because America wanted to have their knowledge because the Cold War was now in play. And they did, of course, the same thing with Paperclip with some of the Nazi scientists. So maybe part of the reason we don't know much about the Fugu balloons is because the US government, wasn't convenient for them to acknowledge that some people were now on the American payroll. I'm just speculating, but that's possible.
That's basically
I
what
think it's
Jeffrey
a
Case-
fair, yeah, I think it's a fair point that obviously they didn't want it to be better known than it is, or it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really the heart of Jeffrey Kay's argument, and he really connects 731 with the Fugo balloons. That some of the same people were involved, and likely it was continuation of some of that research.
Yes. Recommended researcher, Dr. Jeffrey Kay. Yes. Volunteer to read next, please, at N.E. Howard Hunt's descriptions.
I can volunteer.
Thank you.
In E. Howard Hunt's descriptions of the activities of the OPC political and psychological warfare staff, he suggested a significant aspect of operations included publishing content in newspapers. Specifically, Hunt wrote Hugh Troy formed a group of personnel who would generate a large amount of material that found its way into newspapers around the world. The assertion is certainly supported by any number of documents and accounts of OPC activities. It is a given that propaganda techniques include such methods. James Carrion wrote about interesting potentially related circumstances, as mentioned earlier, in his books Anachronism and The Roswell Deception. Each may be downloaded in searchable PDF at his blog, historydeceived.blogspot.com, for free. Carrion suggested select UFO cases, including the reported 1946 ghost rockets and events, which took place during the fateful UFO summer of 1947, served as opportunities for the American intelligence community. He documented how the press was fed incorrect information about such events by intelligence officers and proposed that published stories had specific purposes. The targeted demographic would not have been the public at large, but a combination of spies attempting to report the information back to their home agencies, along with the ultimate recipients of the messages, such as Joseph Stalin, and the manipulation of their perceptions and resulting actions. It would be somewhat of a given Stalin would not suspect UFO reports to be indicative of otherworldly visitors, but some type of weapons development, classified exotic aircraft, and/or related disinformation effort. This would necessarily make select UFO reports of interest to the global intelligence community. Resulting advantageous opportunities might include, for instance, intercepting diplomatic carriers, transporting coded messages, and subsequently cracking the codes. The task might be made less difficult if intelligence personnel could be reasonably sure they were looking for certain proper nouns and circumstances contained within the coded messages. You will recall we briefly explored Carrion's hypothesis earlier when Colonel Amos advised the Air Force Office of Special Investigations of a UFO report, and the account given to an OSI officer by Amos somehow came to include alleged witness names and an address unknown to all other involved parties. That was curiously the case, even though Amos stated he got the story from one of those parties. Such circumstances might potentially serve a variety of purposes, such as code-breaking efforts, or as a means to identify security leaks if the names surface at a later date, among other scenarios. Another instance of potential interest arose pertaining to the activities of UFO skeptic Dr. Donald Menzel. As explored earlier, the astronomer and astrophysicist worked with the Atomic Energy Commission at Los Angeles. Documents obtained through the FOIA revealed he also worked with the Boston Naval Reserve on code-related matters. At least some of Menzel's work was apparently related to identifying atmospheric conditions most advantageous for activities related to message transmissions, according to previously referenced records already obtained. Hundreds of pages of additional FBI documents pertaining to Dr. Menzel are being processed for release by the National Archives and Records Administration, stemming from the original FOIA request. Carrion suggested that careful and intentional manipulation of UFO reports in the media might lead adversaries to suspect the existence of advanced weapons research and development. While some of the potential benefits are rather obvious, others might be more subtle. This might include anticipating how a figure like Stalin would react to such manipulation and conducting operations accordingly, or, in effect, staying a step ahead of where you're directing his next move. Carrion cited how a specific operation, Project SEAL, was misrepresented to the American press. Reporters were told it was a research project involving an airborne weapon as powerful as the atomic bomb. In actuality, SEAL was an already discontinued project that explored the possibility of creating tsunami waves through underwater explosions. In some instances, Carrion demonstrated the doctored reports about Project SEAL were published on the same 1947 newspaper pages as those that carried stories about Kenneth Arnold's famous UFO sighting. Sweetening the pot even more, Carrion shared how he developed a reason to suspect that even the shape of Arnold's reported craft and the ensuing parade of published saucer reports thereafter potentially played a role in the narrative constructed by the powers that be. Stalin demonstrated a particular post-World War II interest in securing the services of an Austrian husband and wife team of weapons developers. The couple were known to have been working on plans for a disc-like aircraft to act as a long-range delivery system for bombs. The aircraft would theoretically skip across the atmosphere, not unlike a stone across a pond, effectively outdistancing missiles of its day. Carrion therefore proposed an intended effect of misrepresenting Project SEAL, combined with manipulation of the 1947 UFO stories, may have been for Stalin to suspect his American counterparts had landed the Austrian couple and/or outpaced his efforts to achieve the advanced delivery system. Such circumstances may have influenced UFO media reporting, the accompanying rapidly growing public interest, the overlapping of the UFO and intelligence communities, and even the existence of UFO reports themselves. As suggested, Carrion suspected all of this may have ultimately been related to deciphering codes. Public confusion obviously becomes a byproduct of such operations. Mary Jo Watts mentioned in an email that she discovered instances in which research later known to be related to MKUltra was published in mid-20th century newspapers. At my request, she helpfully offered an example. The clipping she shared involved Dr. Geschichter and his work with experimental drugs. My previous research into such topics as the CIA and its descent into the study of hypnosis revealed similar circumstances. Dr. Martin Orne, for instance, published material on hypnosis later known to be the result of his work conducted under the umbrella of the agency. One might suspect such circumstances to be common, and arguments have been competently made the CIA steered the formations of 20th century paradigms in fields such as psychiatry, or at least its funding recipients did. We might wonder what other purposes may have been involved in publishing such stories. I found it interesting when Watts added that, in the course of her research, she came across archived newspapers in which MKUltra related material was published on the same pages as UFO-themed stories. She further noted that even though some of the articles were wire stories, she found it curious the pieces varied a bit from one publication to another, circumstances I happen to be aware Carrion observed in his work as well. Theoretically, if select details were published in a newspaper in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, while alternative details were reported in the same wire story in Los Alamos, New Mexico, one might gain opportunities to collect valuable information on those who incorporate the different keywords into their reports and messages. This might include learning more about their locations, capabilities, interests, and codes used in communications, among other things. The methods potentially stood to assist the code-breaking process, gain intelligence on spy rings, and manipulate the actions of the recipients of the coded messages. There stood to be a lot of reasons intelligence officers might publish news stories in addition to simple propaganda and political warfare. Watts provided me with an image of a page from the March 12, 1956 edition of the Mirror News, pictured below. Across the bottom of the page, from left to right, we find an article on Captain Ruppelt and his book about flying saucers and Project Blue Book, a reference to a book, The Search for Bridie Murphy, which pertained to psychic research, reincarnation, and little-known aspects of the mind, among other esoteric subject matter. And far right, a book on hypnotism by George H. Estabrooks, a Harvard graduate and Colgate psychologist later known for his MKUltra efforts to intentionally split the personalities of undercover spies, aka Manchurian Candidate research. Watts also provided an image of a page of the February 26, 1956 Jackson Sun. Articles covering Ruppelt's book and The Search for Bridie Murphy were published side by side. Additionally provided by Watts was an image of a page from the January 17, 1957 Shamokin News Dispatch. Published the month Major Kehoe took the NICAP reins, the page contained an article on NICAP from Admiral Farney's assertion UFOs moved at speeds that could not be duplicated by Russian or U.S. aircraft. The article was published alongside references to both Hungarian refugees and hypnosis experimentation, topics which would each prove of significant interest to the CIA. Further food for thought can be found in the previously referenced 1953 FBI memo on Pinky Thompson located in the Bureau file on Joseph Bryan III. Readers will recall the memo included documentation of a 1950 employment application submitted by Thompson to the CIA. As shown in the image below, Thompson was documented as listing his position at the time of the CIA application in 1950 as president of Briggs Filtration Company of Washington, D.C. In an effort to learn more about the activities of Briggs Filtration Company, I came across an internet search return which directed me to a 1955 article published in Scientific American and archived at the JSTOR Digital Library. The article, The New Psychiatric Drugs by Harold E. Himwich, curiously pertained to the exploration of new avenues for the application of drugs to treat mental illness, including reference to lysergic acid and mescaline. I soon obtained a PDF of the article from JSTOR and discovered a reference to Briggs Filtration Company located in a full-page advertisement for Alcoa Chemicals. The chemical company, as seen in the image below, proudly demonstrated its collaboration with Briggs to supply the Howard Hughes-owned Trans World Airlines with air filtration systems for its jets. The 1955 Scientific American piece additionally contained an advertisement to sell Douglas aircraft designed for the U.S. Navy. An ad for Hewlett-Packard was also featured in the article.
Thank you, Randy. I appreciate you reading. Thanks.
Back to Howard Hughes again.
Yes, I'm reminded of the guy that once said everything's the same story.
Something that suddenly occurred to me while Randy was reading is that I was doing like a bunch of news clippings on airships a while back, and I noticed, completely unconnected to Carrion's work, that in fact, like a lot of stories about airships would show up alongside stories related to hypnosis. And back in the 1890s, hypnosis was, it was scientifically sort of recognized, but it was also more, kind of an intriguing sort of mysterious topic related to science. And so not to like criticize Carrion, because I think he makes a really good argument. It's just, given the evidence, you can't really substantiate it very easily. And I just wanted to point out that like one reason why a story on UFOs would show up next to a story on hypnosis, like on the same page, could just be because they're in the same section, like they could both go in like the science section of the newspaper or something like that. So
Absolutely. That's a very good point. That fringe topics are going to be like in the same section. Yes. And your point's valid. Thank you for making it. I just want to take responsibility for that. Carrion's argument was limited to that in one instance, he found a news report about Arnold's sighting and a press report about this supposed weapons research and development Project SEAL on the same page. He didn't say anything about hypnosis. That was me kind of embellishing his work.
Well, I find that thesis really compelling personally. So, I mean, that that they were using like words and names, for example, like using the name Kenneth to as a form of signal tracing. I find that really fascinating.
Something too that's been discussed among folks that find it fascinating. One of the things that will sometimes differ from one wire report to another even though it's the same AP service, they'll like get the first name wrong in one of them. And you know, that's kind of back to Amos. Like, how do you just come up with a name out of whole cloth? You know, yeah, it is very interesting and makes sense. Like it might not be correct, but it at least fits a little bit. Like when you look at Amos, like, what does this guy care? You know, to like be calling, and like if you're gonna call the Air Force, you're a CIA officer. Why didn't you call the CIA? You know, like, yeah. So I think it's really compelling too that it has something to do with altering some of the details and the proper nouns, and may even be more complex than, you know, may very well be more complex than I'm able to figure out due to my lack of experience with their tradecraft.
Well, you know, that like coming up with a name from whole cloth, it reminds me of when John Travolta like was at the Oscars and he was introducing Idina Menzel, who wrote that song from Frozen, but he introduced her as like a different name that
Huh.
yeah. But I mean, John Travolta is also a Scientologist, so there could
Yeah,
be something
yeah,
going on.
he's subject to do most anything. Yes.
Jack, in Seth Harp's book, The Fort Bragg Cartel, there is, she was recently charged for something, probably to quiet her. But it's a woman who worked in administration with Delta Force. And she told of how she was really referring to Delta Force soldiers, that it was a normal practice to purposefully alter some details, but change it enough so that it looked like a mistake, or like, oh, well, that must have been just an oversight, but confuse it just enough so that a full story on a soldier could not clearly be found.
Good point. Good point. And to take that a step further too, some of the quote conspiracy theories unquote that might actually be instigated by intelligence agencies for various reasons may include in their communications intentionally misspelled words and things like that to provide plausible deniability that an educated CIA officer would have never misspelled Guatemala. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, so beware the Nigerian prince effect here. But go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, as somebody who has spent a lot of time looking at historical cases and newspaper clippings, it's not uncommon for reporters actually to misspell the names of the people.
Oh, not at all.
Even in the same article. And because a lot of times they just really weren't big on details, or they talk to the person over the phone, and so they're spelling their name based phonetically, and they never bothered to ask the person to actually spell it out. So I think a lot of that is just laziness and lack of detail on reporters' parts as far as getting names wrong, from what I've seen. But it's still a compelling argument that he makes. I'm not entirely convinced of it, to be honest.
I mean, Making a newspaper back in the day, printing a newspaper was a pretty laborious task, so it's pretty common that they would have typos and stuff like that.
Absolutely. It would be extremely common. The argument being made is that it was also an intelligence tool in select circumstances, not that every name discrepancy was an intelligence ploy.
And what's the mechanism here exactly? Like they get a reporter to put in a bogus name for them, and the reporter's like, okay, cool. Like, I'm not sure what I know a lot of people believe in conspiracy theories like Mockingbird, and they believe the CIA had this large network where they controlled the media, and there's just zero evidence for any of that. And so I'm curious what the mechanism would be that they would have to manipulate all these reporters around the US to like change names for their articles.
Anyone care to field that?
I mean, I could see how that would work pretty easily, by having people who are operatives working in the newspaper. Or, I mean, a lot of these newspapers also, were owned by people like Hearst and stuff like that who, would likely be working with intelligence people. So like, I mean, I feel like the newspaper almost can sometimes act as like an arm of an intelligence organization or a government.
I feel this happens though in more limited circumstances and specific cases where they need to like push a story. Like, I don't think that they'd be doing it on such a scale that, there's just multiple articles out there about flying saucers with fake names in order to spread a message. Like, I don't know. I know Carrion gets into where he's done some frequency analysis on the characters, the letters that are used in the names to try and show that it's not normal, that these names like don't fit in a normal pattern of letter frequency analysis for letters for names. And so that says something, but again, I'm not entirely convinced as far as his argument there goes either.
And you should require more conclusive evidence to be entirely convinced. I agree with that. I would also say, though, that it doesn't require reporters all over the place. I think it requires a couple that get something started, and especially today, and then dozens, if not hundreds, of other outlets will just pick up the story. But I would like to hear anyone else's thoughts too on how feasible is agency manipulating the media.
Can I just respond really quickly to Jeff? Like, I agree with you that I don't think that Carrion proves that this is something that was happening, but I do find it to be highly plausible.
Is there any evidence that, I don't know if Carrion talks about this, but it's something called slapping the water. It's when you sort of inject like a situation into society where it sort of forces the target to raise their head. Like you do something and then they sort of are forced to respond, and then you can use that to detect them or, whatever, counteract them. So if this story about Roswell is true, like they're putting out like these words and like using, tracing those words and then maybe triangulating the intelligence, the spy networks or whatever. Like, was there something in addition to that which was being done in a sort of ancillary way to bring that out instead of just relying on the injection of the words?
Yes, and I try to give enough information to give some background, but not go too far into his work. But I would recommend downloading his free book if you haven't read it. the Roswell deception. It's available for free at historydeceived.blogspot.com. And yes, there's a lot of stuff, hundreds of pages that he goes into of why he suspects this happened. He also presented a paper to an intelligence journal that was published. And again, I'll encourage Jeff to, yes, demand conclusive evidence to make up your mind. I'd also suggest that a UFO community that purports to be open-minded be willing to review Carrion's suggestions. Because, yeah, I mean, like, what's the alternative? Like what's the other hypothesis? And that doesn't make his right, but I just think when a former NSA analyst is willing to work on UFO stories, it does deserve attention. But again, I encourage dissent, I encourage discussion, and demanding conclusive evidence to draw a conclusion. Allison.
So, again, as far as the influence on the media, I don't know enough about, I've heard about Project Mockingbird. I don't know enough about the evidence about it, so I trust what you say, Jeff. But in this other book, we're reading Den of Spies by Craig Unger. There's a lot of access journalism that goes on, and so these journalists develop sources and stuff like that. They can be fed false information and not know it, but also they can be used and manipulated in a number of ways. So it doesn't necessarily happen where, like someone from the CIA is like, here, publish this. It's more about them manipulating them and them wanting to keep access. And that seems to be, to me, how that works. Now, that wouldn't explain like misspellings in an article or things like that. But in general, the access journalism is one way. And if you look back, if you look back to the period of time around the Vietnam War and a little bit before that, we know that Catherine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, was really good friends with Bob McNamara and all these other, and of course, Ben Bradley and Bill Casey from the CIA, and all these people, they ran in the same circles. And so I think, while she wasn't a journalist, she ran the paper. I just think there's a multitude of ways where it could be manipulated without it be, or by different motives, without it being like straightforward. That's what it is, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I don't doubt the CIA or the intelligence community in general influences the media in all sorts of various ways. It was just more specifically the point of clarification. Project Mockingbird was a real thing. That was an operation where they wiretapped 2 journalists. Operation Mockingbird is a conspiracy theory that there was a widespread network of journalists helping them promote propaganda and whatnot that worked for them. So there are 2 kind of things that get conflated together. And getting back to just to Carrion, I would say part of the problem with finding hard evidence to support this theory is in just the act of trying to locate these people to see if they really existed. As we saw in like the Colonel Amos case that he brought forward, sometimes it's hard to see if somebody really existed, particularly that long ago, or there's multiple people with the same name. And so it really becomes hard to track down to see if somebody that was mentioned in one of these articles from, say, 1947 existed or not. Like, just because you can't quickly find them doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't a real person that did exist. Not everything's online or available. And so it's hard to track down to even prove that these are fake people or not. And if you can't prove these are fake people with fake names, then how do you prove the argument that they were inserted as fake names?
To that, Jeff, I would counter that whether they existed or not was not the issue. The issue was that Amos inserted them into the story and said he got the information from Corbin, who said he didn't know who those people were. I think that's more the issue.
Well, if you recall, the newspaper actually first published those other people's names, and the newspaper themselves said they talked to the witnesses personally. So again, maybe the paper lied about that and made up the witnesses, but the paper itself, before Amos even got the story, before Corbin even got the story, published those people's names and said they spoke to them over the phone. So I don't know.
Gotcha. I gotcha.
The other aspect, maybe Jeff knows most about this. Carrion is skeptical of Project Mogul as a explanation for Roswell. He cites an FBI memo, I think. It might have been written by or to Director Hoover, mentioning Mogul. And so he uses that as a reason to say that it wasn't really a super secret operation, because why would the FBI be mentioning it if it was that well hidden? Am I recalling that correctly?
I don't remember, but I think that Project Mogul is a really good counter explanation to Carrion's explanation. I
Yeah.
feel like, the kind of perception that I get, and I don't know what motivates Carrion's research, but it feels to me kind of like he's proposing that all of this was orchestrated, basically. So Kenneth Arnold, Roswell, these are like the two like foundational things of UFO history, that like sort of mark the beginning of UFO history. And so if those were orchestrated, that would have massive implications for the entire history of UFOs, like and for Jack's book. Um, uh, but but Project Mogul, it seems like that's a bit more of a parsimonious explanation, without being able to look at Carrion's research, and right off the top of my head, but like, because we know that Project Mogul happened, we know that there were balloon flights, the balloon train flights in the area at that time, and that's really well documented. So, I mean, maybe Carrion's right that it was orchestrated for some intelligence purpose, but I kind of find it hard to believe that Mogul was not involved at all. Like maybe both explanations are correct, but I don't really buy that Mogul was not involved in Roswell.
Yeah, and I don't even really agree with his premise that like the director of the FBI couldn't have known about it, because doesn't he say that in his book, Carrion? I have to read the book, admittedly, but he says that Army counterintelligence was behind this whole use of Roswell to catch Russian spies. But, I would imagine that they'd probably be coordinating somewhat with the FBI, because the FBI, I think, already had a counterintelligence function by then. So it's not surprising that
The FBI definitely would investigate people long before then, for purposes of international security if they were in the US, But I mean, like you're saying, I would need to review Carrion's work too, because we might be being a little bit unforgiving without actually looking at his evidence.
He does reference quite a bit of FBI activity. Yeah.
Yeah. But I imagine that if there was like this large scale counterintelligence operation against Russian spies, then probably Army counterintelligence and the FBI would want to deconflict their efforts. So it's possible that if Army counterintelligence was opportunistically using Mogul, like the Roswell incident, they would probably tip off the FBI to some extent about that. So they're not sort of working at cross purposes to each other. I think maybe Carrion hasn't considered that. And he's gone too much to this exclusive explanation of Roswell as just being counterintelligence, instead of it possibly being just precipitated by a balloon, going off course, mogul. So I think that's, yeah, as Rachel was saying, it could be both.
Yeah, just to
And
give a little bit of context, Project Mogul was a classified project to basically try to detect to see if the Russians were working on nuclear technology. I do also want to just point out that Carrion does have a lot of experience with intelligence, so he might be better positioned. He might not to say that that makes his claims or his argument any better, but he may have more experience and information that might help inform his argument.
The pink elephant in the room with some kind of thief in the woodpile to me always seemed like the press release that a Roswell intelligence group that operated under high secrecy issued a press release. That always seemed peculiar. I think that's a compelling point to build upon whatever the ultimate answers may be around it.
So, just getting back to the memo that Louise was mentioning, there is a September 1947 memo from E.J. Fitch to D.M. Ladd, Dickie Ladd, who was at the time essentially the number 3 guy in the FBI, underneath Hoover and another guy. And they mentioned Operation Mogul in relation to a piece of debris that was found on a farm in Danforth, Illinois. And they were told directly about it. They say they asked this Army engineer person, and they told them it was part of a classified top secret project called Operation Mogul. And so then the FBI Special Agent Reynolds contacted the Intelligence Division of the Air Force and told them that we were just advised this piece of debris was from Operation Mogul. So they sent the debris to Wright-Patterson, had them analyze it. Wright-Patterson came back and told them, no, this was not part of our Operation Mogul. And so there's no confusion that the FBI was told directly about Operation Mogul. Like, there's no reason to think that they wouldn't have known about it. They were told by the Air Force. They were told by the Army engineer, that was working on the project. So again, I don't think that argument that the FBI wouldn't know about Mogul stands, since they were directly told by the Air Force about Mogul.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you guys' input on it, but let's get Carrion's position stated on it before we decide that he was right or wrong about it. Would be a fair thing to say as well.
Maybe we could do a book club on James Carrion's Roswell book.
Yes, maybe we could. Okay. Any closing thoughts, guys? Anything in closing?
Did MKUltra ever, is there any documented instances of it involving like a victim reporting UFOs or alien activity as part of like an LSD trip, or that they were manipulated into seeing a UFO? Or is it just like the overlap is to do with mind control and psychological warfare?
Anyone want to address that? Any ideas?
I don't know how it overlays. I think it's mostly just the intersection of the intelligence officers involved in the Office of Policy Coordination, with like Pinky Thompson being a financier for it and being a shell for it, and then his relation to Brian. So it's kind of like once or twice removed in this book. It through from Jack's research, but less directly associated with the topic itself. More demonstrating how intelligence folks created pop-up shops, worked in secrecy, funded projects, and manipulated people. And it was more of like an aside. And his association with Brian is like, interesting group of people you hang out with, Mr. Brian. That's essentially what we're framing, I guess, in the conversation.
I've never looked at the MK Ultra files. Do they actually get into like the details of the test, like what the test subjects responded in any way? I mean, I know the files available are minimal, a lot were destroyed, but do they even get into that kind of level of detail as to the actual test and results?
Minimally. The hearing transcripts may be some of the best places for, again, just vague hypothetical descriptions, often people trying to shirk responsibility. An answer to Luis's question would be that there's, as I'm sure you already know, there's a lot of overlap between investigators, between self-described UFO experiencers and people that consider themselves to be targeted individuals or victims of mind control. Getting something in a document is much more difficult and complicated, but there a lot of it, as seems to always be the case, is festered by members of the intelligence community themselves that will, on one hand, denounce people stirring up conspiracy theories, and then, like in the case of John Alexander, took C.B. Scott Jones and an entourage to Russia, supposedly investigating mind control and psychic phenomena. And then, like, he told Sharon Weinberger in an interview that she did, I think in 2007, if I'm not mistaken, that the experiments at Guantanamo Bay came out of the mind control experiments, and that a lot of his paraphrasing, but he said a lot of younger congressmen weren't around for the abuses of MK Ultra, and they're willing to go back to that and get back into that kind of research. So, and I bring up Colonel Alexander because UFO people know that for decades he was a staple at UFO conferences. UFOs was his thing, and he would be all about don't stir up conspiracies, and then he'd tell, you know, someone interviewing him on behalf of the Washington Post that MK Ultra was coming back. So that has a lot to do with the overlap as well, is the intelligence community puts it there. Hillenkoetter is overlapping himself.
What happened at Guantanamo Bay with the experiments?
I would suggest one good resource, I'll put it in the show notes, is a paper that was done by Seton Hall Law Department called America's Battle Lab, Guantanamo Bay, and documented how vital signs were taken, and by all objective observations, experimentation was being done on the effects of torture on human beings and how to maximize its use. And these Seton Hall researchers asked, for example, if you've held a prisoner for years and you know they no longer even have any actionable intelligence information, even if they wanted to give it, why are you still conducting these types of interrogations on them? And like, that's one of the reasons I said there's a direct line from MK Ultra to CIA black sites, of which Guantanamo is but one.
Mhm.
I'd also mention, in the context of what extent might intelligence agencies manipulate the media and public perception, that the men we've been exploring were part of a political and psychological warfare unit that distributed information to newspapers and media. I found it particularly interesting that Joseph Bryan was documented by the Marquette researcher to have met with editors of the New York Times in Europe and in New York. And then there were discrepancies and lack of explanations about what the meetings were about, while he was accused of getting non-disclosure agreements from media sources and people that he was accused of giving information, while he denied it and said any meetings he would have been having with reporters would have been to extract information, not give it. But I would just present for consideration that we've been studying a psychological warfare division that were media manipulators. Any other thoughts or comments?
I think that it all comes back to balloons. Everything comes back to balloons. That's my theory.
You may
Balloons are
be right.
balloons are the hated enemy of ufology, but they are extremely integral. I mean, a lot of people just regard them as almost like swamp gas, right? The swamp gas meme. It's become a meme ever since Hynek used it. But yeah. So when people sort of mockingly try to mock skeptics, they will often mention swamp gas or balloons. But in fact, balloons are incredibly, surprisingly, prevalent as actual explanations.
Yeah, I mean, I was only joking, but there's a certain level
No,
of
I know.
truth behind
Yeah.
it. I think
Yeah.
balloons, people do not, I think people just don't realize how powerful a tool some balloons are, I think people in the USSR, during the late 80s probably realized it, but a lot of people in America take for granted just how powerful a psychological tool a balloon is.
People just don't even realize, like, when they hear balloon, they kind of just have an image in their mind of, like, maybe a small balloon, maybe a big balloon, and they don't realize kind of what all these balloons can be, particularly like the modern Chinese balloon. That's a spy platform that is the size of the Empire State Building. It's not a tiny balloon. And this kind of misunderstanding goes all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to Roswell, where people act like, how could a balloon cause the debris field? Well, it wasn't one balloon. It's like 30 balloons with a whole bunch of metal and a big train that's basically the size of, like, a skyscraper. Like, it's not a tiny balloon. So balloons are a lot of things and have packages that can explain a lot of things that a lot of people just don't consider. They just want to dismiss the balloon.
Huh.
Yeah, I'm about to piggyback on that and just like go on like a tangent about Roswell, but I'm not going to. I can tell Jack's getting ready to close up shop.
I hate taking, I love the conversation. I really appreciate all of you. I just don't want to tax your time and attention. So thank you very much for participating. Any burning desires, if anyone has anything they just want to get out. All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate all of your time and attention. Thank you for following along at home. Visit us at expandingfrontiersresearch.org for more resources and links. And thanks for tuning in for another episode of Wayward Sons Book Group.
Let's start.